So our family's adoption story really began back in the spring of 2015. There was a random business trip that Jeremy was to take to Korea, and we were living in Europe at the time. I had just finished my master's, and there was really no reason to not have me join him. So we've been married since 2011, and so it just seemed like a great opportunity to go see a new part of the world. And I came along, and there was definitely a seed that was undeniably planted from this very random trip that we took, which, of course, looking back, it's not random. It was God's plan for our family all along. So while we were here, we learned, that, of course, we saw Korea is so developed. There's such prosperity here. There's such affluence, but at the same time, there's this dual reality that there are children that are left behind in this culture for various reasons. It's a very complex situation. And that was a seed that was planted on our hearts over the next 8 months approximately. We went back to Europe, and ultimately I got a job in the U.S., which took us to Washington, D.C. But during this time, the Lord was undeniably watering this seed. And what started as us just hearing things that fell upon our heart grew into a desire to actually begin the adoption process, and specifically from Korea. This was actually a huge surprise, though, not only in the way that this story kind of was planted and developed, but we believed that we could have biological children. And so the Lord was specifically putting on our hearts to pursue adoption as opposed to having birth children. We started the adoption process with Parker in September of 2015, and God was undeniably moving. We felt as though, we describe it, that the Lord called us to knock on one door, and He opened 10 doors behind that. We were a young couple who, we were very young in our careers. Financially, we were not prepared to take on an adoption. There were so many other things that kind of came along with that. It was just something that we alone could not imagine how it was going to actually happen. And just to look back and see the Lord's favor upon this situation. It gives me, of course, tears to think about His favor upon this time in our lives. The process was actually quite long. It lasted from September of 2015 all the way through April of 2017. And all that time, we saw Parker growing up from across the world. Our matching process with him was actually quite quick, and the wait was quite long. And during that process, towards the end of it, I had a hardened heart that was fearful that the Lord was going to let us meet our child, but yet I would have sadness, and really above the joy of meeting him and being with him, that I was going to look upon him and wonder, why, Lord, did you make this time so long before he was actually in our arms? But by God's grace, and His grace has been lavished upon this situation, I completely understand why the Lord had us wait. That was just part of the story. The pain that was there during that time has been completely erased, and it is just God's grace upon this situation. We were able to come in the spring of 2017 and complete Parker's adoption in Korea. We went to court and ultimately stayed here for about 2 months during that final leg of his adoption. We were able to meet his foster family, which is a lovely couple in their almost 70s. They've been fostering for, I think they've lost track, but it's around 40 years. They're not believers, and obviously we pray that they will come to know the Lord. But they just have such hearts for children. I mean, they've lost count of how many children they've actually fostered, but someplace around 40 children. So it was just a blessed time to be able to meet them and see this loving family that Parker had been with, but also to just look back and see how the Lord so clearly put upon Parker's heart, this is your family, and just to look and see how smooth that transition was. Again, it was the Lord's grace lavished upon us. We returned to the U.S. At the end of his adoption with, again, this seed, this really second seed planted. It really seems like a pattern in our lives that the Lord has planted seeds when we left Korea. And this time it was not only the desire to maintain that connection with Parker's birth culture, which we knew would be beneficial for our family and for him, but at the same time, this deep desire to somehow, in some way, serve not only orphans, but also single moms in Korea. And once again, we didn't know how the Lord would have ever used us, people who knew incredibly little Korean, to be able to actually play a part in this. So at this point, I'll hand the microphone to Jeremy.
Yeah, so as Taylor said, we're back in the U.S. This desire to be in Korea just continues to amplify. The Lord just continues to change our hearts. But we just kept asking ourselves, like, how would we ever get to Korea? I'm not a teacher. I'm not in the military. Like, the opportunities for foreigners here are like few and far between, unless you fall into one of those two categories. So, like, we didn't really think that was even literally possible. But by God's grace, He opened up an amazing career opportunity for me that ended up bringing our family back to Korea less than 1 year when we left with Parker. So it was just one big round trip in the course of a year that brought us back in April of last year. And one of the things as you go through an adoption process is, particularly through the waiting, you have ample time to consider adoption, both as you do adoption and you bring kids into your family, but also to understand your own adoption into God's family. It gives it a whole new perspective. It allows you to delight in what God has done for you in a whole new way. Family came back to Korea from a short vacation to America, expecting to start the new year just continuing through the motions that we've kind of set up in Korea. Life would go on as we know it. The very next morning, we get a phone call from someone who's part of one of these adoption communities, and very ambiguous, but just says, there's an urgent situation, we need to meet with you guys as soon as possible. So a couple hours later, we're at the house of this person. Come to find out there's a newborn baby, just born a few weeks prior. He has an older brother who's 1 year old, who's in an orphanage. The mother would like to give them up for adoption, and she wants them to stay together. And would you guys be interested? And for us, we didn't need to hear any more. Like, that was enough. We knew, like, we will adopt them. And so I think the Lord had been preparing our hearts for that moment to make that decision, in just being rooted in the gospel and knowing that as we continue to pursue adoption, this was all about the gospel and what God has done for us. So we're very early in that process. Things are moving extremely quickly, but we still anticipate the legal process will take some time. There's some unknowns about how the older brother will get out of the orphanage. So we could really use your prayers for that situation, that the Lord would allow this adoption to happen. And just in closing, our hope is that that the Lord would plant many seeds throughout this community, like He did for us. That adoption would just become part of the DNA of this church. It's just a normal part of life. Is that we welcome in the marginalized in our communities, in our city, and we just fold them into the love of God that He's shown us.